The saddest chapter. When Taehyung and Jungkook became strangers in public, without any announcement, without any warning, this moment quietly shook the global scene. Welcome to V Effect. For years, Taehyung and Jungkook stood side by side. But somehow the loudest thing between them was silence. Fans watched every glance, every pause, every moment that felt unfinished. And still no answers ever came. Was it just friendship? Or was there something they never dared to name out loud? Because when questions grew louder, they didn't explain. They didn't deny. They stayed silent. And sometimes silence hides more truth than words ever could. Stay until the end because what they never said might change everything you thought you knew. Silence did not arrive suddenly. It was built slowly, layer by layer, moment by moment, until it became impossible to ignore. After the cameras stopped rolling, after the lights dimmed and the cheers faded into memory, Taehyung and Jungkook kept doing the same thing they had always done. Standing close, saying very little. But this time the quiet felt different. Heavy, deliberate, as if words were being held back. Not because they didn't exist, but because they were too dangerous to release. Fans replayed old footage, searching for cracks. A hand that lingered too long. A look that arrived late but stayed too deeply. Smiles that appeared in public but vanished the second they thought no one was watching. None of it proved anything on its own. Yet together it formed a pattern that refused to disappear. Years passed. The questions didn't. Every time curiosity surfaced, the response was the same. Calm expressions, careful phrasing, and then nothing. No clarification, no boundary drawn, just silence stretched thin across time. That silence became louder than any rumored on stage. They were flawless, professional, controlled. But off stage something shifted. Interactions became rarer, then more guarded. When they did appear together, the energy was tense, restrained, like two people walking carefully around a truth they both knew but refused to touch. Fans noticed the distance but also the contradiction. Because even as they pulled back, they never fully separated. They still gravitated toward each other in subtle ways, sitting closer than necessary, matching emotions without speaking, reacting instinctively as if the other's presence was hardwired into their senses. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. And that made it far more unsettling. The internet filled the gaps they wouldn't. Theories grew sharper, more divided. Some insisted it was all coincidence over analysis, imagination. Others argued that coincidence doesn't last for years, doesn't survive pressure, doesn't look this controlled. What made it worse was what never happened. They never laughed it off. They never shut it down. They never said, "You're wrong." Instead, they let the silence stand. And silence, when chosen, is never neutral. Behind closed doors, the tension seemed to tighten. Public appearances became calculated. Answers became shorter. Expressions became harder to read. It felt as though something had reached a breaking point. Yet instead of exploding, it was being contained. As if the cost of telling the truth was greater than the cost of hiding it. Fans didn't just feel curious anymore. They felt uneasy because people don't protect something for years unless it matters. They don't stay silent under pressure unless there is something at stake. And they don't avoid a subject so carefully unless it has the power to change everything. By the time the silence became obvious, it was already too late to pretend it meant nothing. Something had been buried between Taehyung and Jungkook. Not erased, not forgotten, just hidden. And the longer it stayed that way, the more fragile everything around it became. This wasn't about friendship anymore. It was about what happens when the truth is known but never spoken. And the most dangerous part, silence can last for years, but it always breaks. When silence stretches too long, it stops being passive. It becomes a decision. By the time the distance between Taehyung and Jungkook was visible even to casual viewers, something irreversible had already happened. Not a fight, not a public fallout, but a quiet agreement, unspoken, yet painfully clear that whatever existed between them could no longer move freely. They adjusted carefully, strategically. Their interactions became minimal, but never cold. Warmth still surfaced in fleeting moments. A shared laugh that ended too quickly. Eye contact that lingered half a second longer than safe. Then both would pull back almost at the same time, as if they had rehearsed restraint. That synchronization unsettled people the most because distance usually looks messy, awkward, unbalanced. This didn't. It looked controlled. Every appearance felt measured, every movement deliberate. Jungkook smiled more, but it didn't always reach his eyes. Taehyung grew quieter, his expressions harder to decode. Fans began to notice how often they avoided standing side by side, yet somehow always ended up aligned, facing the same direction, reacting to the same moments, as if separation was physical, not emotional. The questions grew sharper. Comment sections turned tense. Some begged for clarity. Others warned that speculation was crossing lines. The divide inside the fandom widened, mirroring the tension on screen. Still, neither of them addressed it, and that refusal changed the narrative. Silence stopped being protection and started feeling like pressure. The kind that builds when too many people are watching, waiting for a crack, a slip, a moment where the truth leaks out by accident. But nothing did. Not in interviews, not in live broadcasts, not even in moments when emotions ran high. Instead, there were pauses, long ones. The kind where a question is understood but deliberately ignored. The kind that leaves the room heavier than before. People began to ask a different question. Not what was being hidden, but why it had to stay hidden. Because if it was nothing, silence made no sense. Then came the subtle shifts. Lyrics that sounded too personal to be random. Creative choices that felt intentional, timing that raised eyebrows. Individually, they were harmless. Together, they hinted at a story unfolding quietly in the background. A story no one was allowed to confirm. Some fans started to worry, not about rumors, but about the weight of carrying something alone. Because whatever existed between them, it wasn't fading, it was being compressed, and pressure changes people. Jungkook became more careful with his words. Taehyung became more expressive without speaking, letting emotions surface through art, through absence, through moments that felt loaded but unexplained. It was as if both were speaking in a language only they understood. The tension reached a point where silence no longer felt safe. Not for them, not for the people watching. Not for the image that had been so carefully maintained. And yet breaking it still seemed impossible because silence had become more than avoidance. It had become a shield, a boundary, a line that once crossed could never be redrawn. By the end of that year, one thing was clear to anyone paying attention. This was no longer about hiding something from the public. It was about deciding whether the truth was worth what it would destroy. And the most unsettling part, they hadn't made that decision. Yet there comes a moment when silence stops protecting people and starts trapping them. For Taehyung and Jungkook, that moment arrived quietly. No announcement, no headline. Just a subtle shift in the air that longtime fans felt before they could explain it. Something was no longer being held back out of caution, but out of fear. Fear of consequence, fear of misunderstanding, fear of what would happen once the truth stopped belonging only to them. They were no longer just avoiding questions. They were avoiding each other's gaze in public settings, careful not to reveal too much with a single look. Yet, when they thought the cameras had moved on, the restraint cracked just slightly, enough to be noticed by those who had been watching for years. And that contradiction made everything worse because it suggested this wasn't distance born from fading feelings. It was distance enforced. The pressure didn't come from one place. It came from expectations layered on expectations. From an image built so carefully that even a whisper of deviation felt like a threat. From knowing that once something is named, it can never be unnamed. So they chose endurance instead. Jungkook leaned into discipline, into perfection. He performed like nothing was wrong. Like the tension wasn't sitting just beneath the surface. But there were moments, brief, unguarded, when his expression gave him away. A hesitation before answering certain questions. A breath held too long. A smile that appeared a second late. Taehyung responded differently. He withdrew. Not entirely, but enough to be felt. His presence became selective. His words, when they came, felt weighted. As if he was saying everything except the one thing people wanted to hear. Art became his language. Absence became his statement. And between them sat something unfinished. Fans started noticing patterns that couldn't be coincidence anymore. How they avoided confirming anything while also refusing to separate completely. How their narratives never contradicted each other yet never aligned clearly either. It was like watching two people protect the same secret from opposite sides. That's when the tone of the conversation changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was concern, because secrets this heavy don't just disappear. They erode. They strain relationships. They turn silence into a constant negotiation. What can be shown? What must be hidden? What risks being exposed by accident? And accidents almost happened. A glance held too long, a reaction too emotional to be neutral, a moment of tension that slipped through editing untouched. Each time the internet erupted, each time the silence returned thicker than before, people began to wonder if the silence was mutual anymore. Because holding a secret together requires balance. And balance is fragile when the world keeps pushing. It was clear whatever existed between Taehyung and Jungkook wasn't something that could simply fade with time. It was something unresolved, something paused, something waiting. Waiting for courage, waiting for exhaustion, waiting for the moment when staying silent would hurt more than speaking. And that moment was getting closer because silence doesn't end gently. It ends when someone breaks. Silence doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures first. By this point, the strain was no longer subtle. It showed up in timing, in distance, in the way moments felt carefully edited. Even when they were live, fans sensed it, not because anything obvious was said or done, but because the atmosphere around Taehyung and Jungkook felt tight, like a room with no air left. They were still moving forward, still working, still smiling when required, but something essential was being withheld. What made it unbearable was how close the truth seemed. Always within reach, never touched. Every appearance felt like it might be the one where something slipped. A word said too honestly, an expression held too long, a reaction that couldn't be explained away. And yet, every time restraint won. That kind of control doesn't come from comfort. Comes from stakes. Behind the scenes, the distance between them no longer felt strategic. It felt personal, not in the sense of anger, but of unresolved weight, like two people carrying the same burden, but no longer able to share it the way they once did. There were moments when their paths crossed and neither knew how to move first, because acknowledging what was there, even privately, meant admitting how much had been lost by staying silent. Fans began to notice how often their names were no longer mentioned together, how stories avoided overlap, how narratives were separated just enough to feel intentional. It wasn't erasure, but it wasn't closeness either. It was containment, and containment has limits. The emotional toll began to surface in different ways. Jungkook's intensity sharpened, his focus unwavering but brittle. T's presence felt heavier, his expressions more introspective, as if he was constantly weighing what to reveal and what to protect. Neither looked free. Speculation intensified, but so did empathy. Because whatever the truth was, it was clear that silence had become a prison of their own making, one built to protect everyone else, even at their own expense. The question was no longer what they were hiding. It was how long they could survive hiding it. Because something had changed between them. Not the feeling itself, but the cost of pretending it didn't exist. The unspoken agreement that once felt safe now felt suffocating. And the more the world watched, the less room there was to breathe. By the end of that chapter in their story, one thing was undeniable. This silence was no longer sustainable. It had reached the point where staying quiet wasn't neutral. It was a choice that would define everything that came next. And somewhere beneath all that restraint, something fragile was beginning to crack. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough to know the breaking point was no longer a question of if only who would reach it first. The breaking point didn't announce itself. It never does. It arrived disguised as routine. Another schedule, another appearance, another moment meant to look effortless. But beneath the surface, something had shifted beyond repair. The silence that once felt mutual now felt uneven. Like one side was holding on while the other was running out of strength. Fans sensed it immediately. There was a sharpness in the air when Taehyung and Jungkook were mentioned in the same breath. A hesitation, a pause that didn't exist before. It was the kind of pause that happens when a name carries too much history to be spoken lightly. When they crossed paths publicly, the tension was undeniable. Not dramatic, not explosive, just restrained to the point of discomfort. Their movements were careful, their reactions controlled, as if both were afraid that one wrong step would undo years of discipline. But control has a cost. Behind the composure, exhaustion crept in. Not physical exhaustion, emotional, the kind that comes from constantly editing yourself, from remembering what not to feel, from pretending that something unfinished doesn't exist. Jungkook felt it in moments of stillness. When the noise faded and there was nothing left to distract him, that's when the weight pressed hardest. Because silence had stopped being a shield and started feeling like abandonment, not of each other but of themselves. Taehyung felt it differently. For him, the silence began to feel like erasure, as if pieces of a shared past were being slowly rewritten into something safer, cleaner, easier to digest. And the more that happened, the more distant he became. Distance became language. They stopped looking for each other instinctively, or rather, they caught themselves before doing it. That split second of restraint told a story no one wanted to acknowledge. Habit doesn't disappear overnight unless something forces it to, and something had. The unspoken agreement that once held them together now felt like a wall. A wall neither had built alone, yet both were trapped behind. The question of truth wasn't just dangerous anymore. It was personal. Because what happens when silence costs you the one person who understands it best? The fandom felt the shift too. The tone changed. The excitement dulled into worry. People didn't ask for confirmation anymore. They asked if everything was okay. That question hurt more than any rumor ever could because it implied what everyone was starting to see. Whatever was being hidden was no longer harmless. It was affecting them, shaping them, pulling them in different directions. And still no explanation came. Now, silence wasn't just about protecting an image. It was about avoiding a reckoning, about delaying the moment when everything carefully balanced would finally tip. But balance doesn't fail dramatically, it fails quietly. One day something didn't align. A reaction was missing. A familiar warmth was gone. Not replaced with anger but with absence. An absence, when it appears where something once lived, is impossible to ignore. That was when the truth became unavoidable. Whatever existed between Taehyung and Jungkook had reached a crossroads. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because silence had taken too much from it. And at that crossroads there were only two choices left. Speak and risk losing everything, or stay silent and lose each other. Anyway, the most dangerous part, they were running out of time to decide. There's a moment when avoidance stops working. Not because the truth demands to be spoken, but because the body refuses to keep lying. That moment came without warning. It showed in the smallest things first. Jungkook answering a question too quickly, then stopping himself. Taehyung holding his gaze somewhere just off camera as if grounding himself before stepping back into control. These weren't mistakes. They were cracks, brief, human, impossible to script. Silence was no longer clean. For the first time, it felt like the weight wasn't shared evenly anymore. One of them was carrying more of it, absorbing the strain, pretending endurance was still possible. And the other could feel it slipping, feel the imbalance growing every time nothing was said. They had crossed from protection into damage. Whatever once made the silence feel necessary now felt outdated, yet still binding, like a rule written for a past version of themselves, enforced long after it stopped making sense. Breaking it felt dangerous. Following it felt cruel, so they stalled. Schedules grew fuller. Paths crossed less often. When they did share space, it felt formal, almost foreign.